Cartoon Crossroads Columbus acknowledges that the ancient ancestors of the eastern woodland tribes, now referred to as the Adena and Hopewell cultures, inhabited the land we know as Ohio. Their descendants include the living nations of the Shawnee, Miami, Wyandot, Delaware, and Seneca Cayuga. We honor and respect the diverse indigenous peoples connected to this place where we gather. And also thanks to our sponsors, including the Greater Columbus Arts Council, the Ohio Arts Council, White Castle, and UBS. So, hello and welcome to a talk that's titled The Tangled Forest of Art and Science, a talk about educational comics with Jay Hosler. My name is Craig Fischer, and I teach comics and film at Appalachian State University, and I'll be moderating this panel and asking the initial questions, though of course we'll open it up for some discussion at the end. Today we'll be painfully grilling this man, the aforementioned Dr. Jay Hosler, a professor of biology and chair of the biology department at Juniata College in Pennsylvania, and a remarkably prolific, accomplished cartoonist and graphic novelist. It's my hope that during this panel you get a sense of the importance of Jay's work and listen to his opinions about how important art and narrative are, or should be, in science and education comics. So join me in welcoming Jay back to CXC. All right, Jay, as a practitioner, how do you define the term educational comics or the term science comics?
Yeah, it's a good question. I hate the term. I mean,
good question.
Yeah, no,
hate the answer.
No. It is a great question because it's undeniably the case that what I do is attempting to teach you something. And so within that context, it's educational. I think that what you see are really sort of two approaches to this. Approaches that are pretty strictly didactic in terms of a graphic novel, right? And then those that, in my opinion, attempt to do something actually novel with the medium. So for me, the strictly didactic pathway, it works for some people, but it's an elaborately illustrated textbook. And in some sense, as I'm writing these things, my thought process, having stood in front of a class for 23 years, my wife's a middle school teacher, we talk about teaching all the time. She's a middle school science teacher, I should say. There's a tremendous amount of resistance to learning about this topic. Now, do I think everyone should be a STEM person? No. That would be a really boring world. But we are in a world where everyone votes, we hope. Okay, well, in the United States, 50% of the people vote, maybe. And you are ultimately voting for people who will make decisions that will affect things like climate, stem cell research, abortion, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Vaccinations.
Right? So, vaccinations. So you want a populace that is not afraid of science and that doesn't view science as this sort of mystical realm that they just don't have access to because in sixth grade, they were told they don't do science and math very well, right? Unfortunately, a lot of the kids that I get, even the biology majors, but also the non-majors I teach, they already have this entrenched belief that I can't do it. So I can remember,
Please.
You brought props. So
I
this
did.
book, Optical Allusions, is a comic book textbook that I got, and it was funded by a grant from the National Science Foundation, and I used it for my sensory biology class. It's about the eye. And I can remember using this and having a student in my non-majors class. She was an ed major, an elementary ed major. And I can remember she came to me once in office hours and she sat down across the table from me and she said, I'm just really worried about this class. And I sort of stared at her blankly and she goes, I can't do science. And it was not a big class. I knew what everyone's grade is. She had like a 98. Okay, so the point is that this impression that I can't do this, whatever it is, in my case it's science because that's the area I'm most familiar with. I can't do this will actually lead students to deny the evidence of their senses. Deny the fact that after 10 quizzes and 2 tests and 1 paper, you have a 98. you are capable of understanding this and you're capable of articulating it. So for me, that's my audience, the people who are resistant.
Right.
And for me, the only way to go there is with a narrative. Because if they wouldn't pick up a textbook,
Right.
they're not going to pick up this book just because it has a lot more pictures, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it does make sense. You actually answered my first 5 questions, so
Nice.
I appreciate it. But let me follow up.
Just
Let me
let me
follow
talk
up
on
another thing. Another reason, another argument for narrative. I'm going off script here.
Yeah.
Another argument for narrative is that who is it who once said that people will not try to say what they don't care about?
That was Gould.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, so I think if you've
I think
got-
it's the epigraph for one of
It
yeah.
is. So what is that? Let's see. We cannot win this battle to save species and environments without forging an emotional bond between ourselves and nature as well. For we will not fight to save what we do not love. That was Stephen Jay Gould.
So you think, I mean, in addition to sort of luring people into accepting science and engaging with science, it also convinces people to love
Right,
the
I think-
beings who are
and-
sort of ruled under that sort of way of looking at the world through
No,
the
I
science
think that,
lens.
I think that this is another thing that as scientists we have not done very effectively. All right, so when I was a postdoc at Ohio State, I would spend my days going to a beehive, collecting bees, setting them up. I would spend 4 hours setting them up ready for an experimental learning procedure, which would then take 4 hours in the afternoon. And it was tedious as hell. But it was the tedium that I enjoyed, right? And I felt a passion for it. And one of the things that
Why did you love the tedium?
Well, I shouldn't say, maybe I didn't love the tedium. It was the tedium that I was willing to endure for a passion. Maybe that's a better way to put it, right? So we all have those things, right? Whether you're a stamp collector, comic collector, whether you, my wife quilts, the idea of cutting out voluminous pieces of fabric and sewing them together makes my mind melt, but she loves it, right? So there's tedium that we enjoy, and we do so in service of a passion, right? This is the thing that oftentimes scientists don't do very well, is they don't convey that emotional component. You don't do that if you don't love it. And you don't love it unless you really love this natural world, at least from a biological standpoint. So the use of narrative helps people connect to some emotional component to the natural world that I think that scientists feel, but maybe don't, well, certainly don't express the way we should. And when I have people come up to me, and I won't spoil the ending of Clan Apis, but I will say
Oh, I
that-
will in a few minutes.
Okay,
Don't worry.
so the woman who's tabling next to me, Andrea, we did a book swap last night, and she told me that this morning she sobbed after reading, getting to the end of this. Okay, now you're crying for a cartoon bee that never existed. Okay, now if I can get you there, then maybe when you read an article about bees, about colony collapse, about the use of pesticides and how it's interfering with bees' ability to find nectar, to store nectar. Maybe if you have a more emotional connection to you, that becomes more than just a news fact, right? Maybe you feel a connection to that might stimulate you to action, but at the very least stimulates you to awareness. So.
No, that makes perfect sense. And interesting that that's a quote from Stephen Jay Gould, given how he has proselytized in very clear, lucid prose exactly why we should care about science and what we
Right.
should know about science.
Right.
I did also want to ask another question, and this is maybe where I'm spoiling the ending. I'm skipping past Stegron since I think we've left him
Oh, man.
But the end of Clan Apis, which I'm spoiling right here, you told me on the phone when we were getting ready for this that not only were you trying to obviously emotionally move your reader by the death of the protagonist, but also that you were expressing your own fear of death.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, was there a context for that? Like, you were a fairly young man when you did this book.
23 years ago, so I was in my 30s.
Right. Why fear of death? Why so early?
I don't know. I mean, my poor children have the same anxieties that my wife and I have. So there you go, genetics. That's a little science lesson for you. It's funny. My whole life, I can remember having a wart on this thumb that I'd picked at and made red. Okay, so there's one piece of data. And my mom had at one point said, yeah, if you have a red thing and it's sore, that might be cancer. And I can remember driving through town, holding my thumb out the window, crying in middle school because I thought, oh, this is cancer. I'm going to lose my thumb and then I'm going to die. And
why did you think holding it out the window?
I was just, whatever, blow it off, do something. And so I always had this fear, right? And maybe it was being the product of the 80s where, you had to hit these certain milestones, right? So I was afraid I was going to die before I graduated from high school. Then I was afraid I was going to die before I had a girlfriend. That almost happened. And then and then I was afraid I was going to die before I got married, and afraid I was going to die before I had kids, afraid I was going to die before I knew my kids. I mean, it sounds psychotic to say it out loud.
No.
But this book was me this was my therapy. And my thinking was that I could tell you an interesting story about bees, but unless I'm telling you a story that means something emotionally to me, it's probably not going to be as effective. Or at least that was the gamble. I mean, it was the first comic or graphic novel I did, so it was a gamble, right? But my sense was, having read tons of other comics and then seeing interviews with people, I started to see that when I cared most about a work, and it didn't matter what character it was, right? It could be a Marvel character, it could be an indie character. When I responded to that character and then read an interview that this person had channeled something personal, I mean, that was a connection that was probably obvious if I'd taken more lit classes, but that was what I realized I needed to do to make this effective. And so, and the truth is, by working through this, it forced me to sort of confront a lot of those fears. And there are lines like, at one point, the Queen says, "Nobody survives life."
Right.
And I know that's like a profundity that's not really, I guess my son calls it a deepity, a fake, fake depth. But for me, who was this sort of honestly non-reflective bumpkin from northern Indiana, to sort of wend my rural brain to that spot, that was quite a moment. And so this idea that, I'm not going to survive, so I'm not going to fret about it either, because I'm going to miss out on stuff. And
so
hopefully,
it cured you of that fear mostly, or? Mostly,
it did. It was not something I obsess about anymore. Right. The Prozac also helps. I mean,
it's interesting because one of the things that you were talking about earlier was the issue of gatekeeping, where students feel like, oh, I can't do science, or I can't do math, or whatever. A litany I hear all the time from my students who say, well, I came to school and I'm going to be an English major now because I can't handle those other things. Did you ever feel either apprehensive about going into science or apprehensive about doing art? Because you're kind of straddling both worlds, and I was wondering which one you found more intimidating.
I am both. I've never really felt like I belonged in either, like solidly. Like, I had a friend once joke and they're a good friend when they know all of your neurotic elements.
So he knew about your thumb? Or?
Yeah, that's right. Not know about the thumb. But they looked at me once and said, as a scientist, you make a great artist. And as an artist, you're a terrific scientist.
Isn't that like something they said to Will Eisner? He's a pretty good artist and he's a pretty good writer, but when you put them together, he's really good.
Yeah. So I've always felt sort of neurotic about that. I mean, there were moments in college when I thought, I'm not going to be able to do this science stuff. I got a C+ in genetics. I'm like, genetics, I'd come to school to be a geneticist. But so much of that path was really finding the thing that I was interested in. So I was really nervous at that point, and then realized after taking a neurobiology class that, this 4-pound mass of jelly that can rewire itself, that stimulated my imagination in a way that I had never had it stimulated before. Right. And it connected to this notion of creativity and art, right? And the truth is, in college, the choice was science or elementary school art teacher. Those were the two things that I was thinking about at the time, PhD or, a BA. And but the art that I was doing at the time was so rudimentary. I mean, when I started cartooning for my college newspaper, it was My first submission was in pencil on lined paper. And it was my freshman year that I submitted that, and they turned it back. And I was such an arrogant person. I'm like, well, I will not be working with you then. And so I waited until my sophomore year to realize, oh, well, yeah,
maybe I will be working with
maybe I'll put it on not lined paper. So there's always been a lot of those trepidations. Max is with me, my oldest son, we were driving around, and I was boring him with all the highlights of when I lived here. And he looked at me and goes, you really love this town? And I'm like, yeah, I think I do. Because in the 4 years I was here as a postdoc, even though I had my PhD, I was still like, I don't know if I can do this. Right. And I applied for a grant from the NIH for my research. And I applied for a grant from the Xeric Foundation, Peter Laird's foundation, which is designed to give you just enough money to cover printing costs for an indie comic.
And you were known in fandom by then because of Cowboy and
so
the Comics Buyer's Guide and such. So.
And so I got both of those grants in the same week. I was much more excited about the $1,500 than the $300,000 from the NIH. But I realized that this was the town in which I felt like, oh, I can do both. Right? That, there was this affirmation from external people, right? Mom wasn't telling me, you're a very nice cartoonist, dear. We're so proud of you as a scientist, too. It was somebody else that was saying that. And so I have really warm feelings about it, but it probably wasn't until between 96 and 2000. So I was in my early 30s that I sort of really felt like, okay.
Were you said that you felt like this was a town where you could do both. Was the Billy Ireland an influence on you? Like the fact that there was some sort of academic acknowledgments of the importance of comics? So
I didn't meet Lucy Caswell until late in my time here.
Okay.
What I think was probably, and that was helpful, but I think that probably the biggest thing was Gib Bickle and the Laughing Ogre. So I cannot give props enough to Gib Bickle. He's still a really close friend. He published
several of your early books.
Yeah, well, the Cowboy book, right?
Yeah. And
that's right, the first.
Apis,
that's right. And so, coming in, I'll tell this. These sound like little vanity stories, but these are the moments when I'm like, oh, okay. So I had at the time when I came here a weekly strip in the Comics Buyer's Guide called Cowboy. And he was a kid that got bitten by a radioactive cow, got cow powers, right? It was just a total pastiche. It was my way of parroting superheroes just because I'd grown up with them. And I walked into the Laughing Ogre the first time we moved here because it was recommended. And I sat down and I was filling out an in-store subscription form. And I wrote my name, Jay Hosler. And he goes, are you the guy that does Cowboy? And I'm like, oh, we are friends forever.
A fan.
My God, I love you. So, so that was
validating.
Yeah.
I wanted to talk about another figure who I think is really important in your life because he appears so much in your work, and that is Charles Darwin. So, for example, wrong one. There we go. He obviously is the central protagonist in Sandwalk Adventures. Mm-hmm. And then he also appears in Optical Allusions. Yep. He also appears in the evolution book that you did with the Cannon brothers.
Right.
What does Darwin represent to you, and why is he so important? I mean, besides being the father of modern biology.
Yeah, you know what? I mean, I think that, rural Indiana kid was being groomed to be a minister. That was me. He was groomed to be a minister, right? But had these interests in biology. And, frankly, there was a point at which I was starting to feel this tension of trying to reconcile these two things. And I couldn't. And that was tough, right? Because I didn't want to tell my mom that I think I believe in evolution, Mom. That's in Northern Indiana, that's right up there with things you just don't want to say to Mom. And so I carried that as a burden for a long time. Having read his biography.
Right. He grappled with that as well.
All right. He carried that burden for a long time. I mean, when he first wrote to Hooker, his friend, he wrote, I feel as if I'm confessing a murder. right? When he first started talking about natural selection, I feel, and he knew exactly what that meant. He meant that he was taking a shot at man's central position in the universe as prescribed, and God's central position. And so to know that, this guy struggled with this, still published the book, transformed the way we think about the world.
And went against his own family. I mean, his wife was a devout believer.
She was, right.
Yeah,
right.
So.
She wrote him a letter once expressing her fear that they would not be in heaven together. And he wrote in his autobiography that he would weep over that letter regularly. He would read it and weep over it regularly. So here's a guy that has this idea that's a huge idea. If you're a biologist, this is the idea. This is the contextualizing idea. If biology is a pie, evolution is the pie pan, right? And so he has this idea, but he's faced with societal, familial pressures that are super daunting.
Right.
And so not only do I just admire the work that he did, but I thought, choose. By comparison, my weight is my mom.
Right.
And she got over it when I published. This is the other thing about parents that I think we underestimate, right? They'll say things and you'll absorb them and you'll say, oh my God, she does not want me to believe this. But the minute I did that, she's like, well, that's okay. That's okay. And she's just like my grandmother. Right. I was at my grandmother's deathbed. She was a teacher, one-room schoolhouse teacher. We were sitting there once and I was wetting her lips and she had stopped eating. She was going to die. And we started talking about teaching and she goes, it's very warm sometimes. And she looked at me and goes, you never teach bare-legged, do you? Which meant in shorts.
Oh, okay.
and I said, well, Grandma, what do you think? And she goes, no, you wouldn't do that. I'm like, well, I don't think this is a time I can lie to you. I have. She goes, oh, that's all right. That's all right. There are these things that you hold as important until someone close to you does it. And then you realize, okay, you know what? That's not the line I'm going to draw. That's not where I'm going to,
I'm just relieved you didn't wear shorts today.
Well, I got pants on. It's not on Zoom.
If I can ask a couple personal questions and tell me to stop if I'm.
I've already talked about my ward, so it's all downhill.
Yeah, that's all downhill. That's right. Your neurosis is completely exposed.
I'm an open book reader.
Do you believe in God still? Because it's obviously an issue, especially in the early books, where you get a sort of creation myth for the bees at the beginning of Clan Apis, and then you get this sort of almost parody of religion in Sandwalk Adventures, where you have for those of you who don't know, who haven't read Sandwalk Adventures, it's a debate between Darwin and a mite that lives, a follicle mite that lives in his
left
eyes,
eyebrow, yeah.
His left eyebrow, and the mite thinks that Darwin is God. And talks about himself as, talks about Darwin as God. At one point, figures that he's the chosen one who God is talking to. It's kind of a parody of religion. I mean,
it was that book again. If we're looking at personal things, Mara, her path is my path, right? So she had certain beliefs. They came in conflict with sort of scientific thought. And it was through a dialectic that she is working through this, right? So for me, it was working through it. They didn't know I was working through it, but working through it with my faculty members, et cetera, et cetera. Right. They were exposing me to these ideas. They were giving me books, readings, pushing me in certain directions. And so that was very much a part of it. I think that, I don't. Well, I know I don't believe in God. But do I go to the Stone Church of the Brethren every weekend and sing in the choir? I do. Why do I do that? Well, because humans are full of conflicting emotions. But like the Stone Church, my kids are atheists. They've been atheists their entire life. We go. And why? Because they're also leftists. And so I like the Stone Church because we go do things for people. And so for me, that sense of community, that sense of a group of people who are coming together, in this case for a service, but then during the week, feeding the homeless, right? Taking food to Meals on Wheels. This organization that goes and does things, that is as close to God as I think it is, when humans get together and socially do things for people other than their families, right? When we start doing those types of things. So not in the religious sense, but in the sense that humans could come together and do beautiful things for other people, yeah.
I feel the same way. I mean, I go to the Unitarian Universalist Church in Boone, which is about the most loosey-goosey you can become with a church before you're not a church anymore. But I do it for the people more than anything else. I mean, and of course, it's a religion where you have that kind of freedom to say, I'm an atheist, I'll come to church, you know, and nobody blinks.
Right, and everybody, and it's interesting because at where I go, they all know how I feel. It's the husband and wife team are academics, are academic theologians. I've told them how I feel. They still ask me to read books to the children at the children's sermon, right? I mean, because it's a community. That element, that earthly element, for lack of a better way of saying it, is the most important thing.
I also wanted to ask another question about the issue of evolution. Obviously, it was a tension in your family. Is it a tension with some of your students? I mean, I know that the biology department at Juniata is the big draw. So theoretically, maybe the students who didn't believe in evolution would select out. But is it a problem sometimes with students?
You know, it isn't. I mean, I think maybe what the problem is that we do have students who are creationists, who don't believe in evolution, who do the biology major, but who don't feel comfortable talking to us about that. So I teach an evolution class every 3 years. And, you know, I'll go through the class and I have absolutely, the way this class is set up, I don't disparage anyone's beliefs. I mean, that kind of diversity is important, I think, to an institution. It's a philosophical approach. It enriches us. It's also cultural. These are the things that we want. So I have no desire to say, I never poo-poo anything.
No,
That's never a part of it. I sort of hew pretty strongly to just talking about the science. And it usually feels like, wow, it's going fine. And then I will get kids at the end of the semester on their student evaluation to say, I don't believe any of this. I felt like I couldn't say anything. I mean, that's heartbreaking because I want them to say, well, I guess I'm confident enough that if they say, I don't believe that, that I could either find evidence to support it or admit that that's an empty spot. That's a play, because there are gaps.
And I think you definitely could respect what they have to say regardless of whether or not you agree with it, which is part of our role as a teacher.
Having a discussion.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, this is what's missing sometimes from classrooms is that we don't have discussions, which is why I don't really lecture as much anymore and mostly just spend my time throwing out case studies, which are essentially stories, right? You have these narratives that present a problem and then you let them work on it and then you come together. And so that notion of solving problems, like I'm teaching an animal behavior class right now, and I don't have a textbook anymore because I use these case studies. I would make it about, if you just did the readings from the textbook, we would have used an eighth, a sixth of the book. It wasn't worth it anymore. And so, because
especially how expensive textbooks are.
Right. So
ridiculous.
The key was, okay, I'm going to pick these few ideas and then we're going to talk about them, because it isn't until you talk about things and wrestle with things. And that was actually one of the big motivators, has always been a big motivator for this, is that, people do want to talk about things, but they have to have that sort of, I call it the tools of imagination, right? If you know nothing about a topic, then you are going to be less likely or less inclined to ask a question because you're going to feel stupid. Yeah. But if you can get just a little bit of knowledge, and that's the key. These things they're not meant to be textbooks. They're meant to give you just a rudimentary amount of information to present you with enough so that you can be slightly conversant. Right. And once you're slightly conversant, once you have your foot in that sort of dialogue door, then you can start extracting information systematically, or learning what you want to learn. If that makes sense.
No, it makes perfect sense. But the irony, of course, is that I find most textbooks that are used in college classes to be oppressive, honestly, because they try to be too comprehensive about the subject, and they tend to be sort of like, flattening the students and flattening the discipline more than anything else. That's why I think this is a really important book, because it's your attempt to sort of give them just enough information to dream, and then you can have that sort of discussion. So it's not a textbook, but it works better at teaching the students than a textbook, I would assume.
The thing is, there's so much science entrenched in what we know, right? I could tell a kid, hey, DNA. They're like, oh, I know what DNA is. 30 years ago, that would have been like, maybe I know. I mean, if I said the word synapse, half of my students who'd never taken a science class know I'm talking about the brain, right? Because they've heard insults like you have a one synapse brain, something like that. So there's all this, in terms of information access, kids today are way ahead of where we used to be. It's just the ability to think about that as being plastic, right? That just because you have that element of information doesn't mean it's a concrete. It can't change, or that you can't question it.
No, absolutely, I agree. Yeah. I wanted to ask a question about 2015's.
Did you have a question?
Oh yeah, did you have a question?
No.
Oh, okay.
Not yet.
Okay.
Not yet. Well, you're on deck. I'll call you first. I wanted to ask you about 2015's Last of the Sandwalkers, because this is the book where it seems to me like you work within a very specific genre. That is, you combine your love of biology, especially with insects, with epic fantasy. Is that fair to say?
Yeah.
Why? Why epic fantasy? Is it a genre that you've always loved, or?
I think everyone loves an adventure story, right? And I always love an adventure story. The thing is that I have this comic called Cowboy that I did, right? It was a collection. And there's a moment in Cowboy where he's got to save this airplane that's falling, right? And he's like, I got to be clever. He goes, there's a problem. I'm not clever, right? I always think that when I see these amazing saves done by some superhero with a split second to go on, and I realize, man, I would be dead. I would be totally dead. I would not be able to think about that. And so to be able to write characters that are just sort of a normal group, these are beetle insects that get thrown into our world from their world. And they have to navigate out, and they have to confront things that we see all the time, like a bird, which probably doesn't intimidate us too terribly much, but they have to solve problems. They have to get through that. And they have to do so with the smarts that they have. And so I didn't write any geniuses in the story. I mean, I didn't. And so putting them in that sort of epic thing. And the truth is that the story is really, they live in an oasis, they get thrown into our world across a desert, and really the story is just getting home. It's not even getting a ring to Mount Doom.
Or getting a ring and then going home.
It's just, I just want to get home. And I got to navigate all these issues. And so that for me, the simplicity of that, but also the complexity, because I also got to tell a story about family, right? So, if this is about death and this is about my wrestling with science and faith, this is a story about my family, right? This is my Fantastic Four, right? This is my family of four. And, I took elements of my own family and I shuffled them around. But I can look at each one of the characters and say, okay, that comes from Max and that comes from Jack, right? So the lead is this little beetle named Lucy. Her name comes from what would have been Max's name. Lisa was pregnant with Max here when we were postdoc. And we went to the doctor, he did an ultrasound. He said, oh, we're 90% sure it's a girl. So for a month, we named Max Lucy. I imagined taking Lucy to basketball games and things like that. And then the next month, he does the ultrasound again, and that 10%? So it's Max. So Lucy is named after who Max could have been, but she's also sort of a smartass, and that's definitely Jack, right? And so this was, again, that's the sort of the strong emotional connection, is being able to write about my family.
This is the chance for you to talk about your new book, which is this book, Santiago.
Yep.
Santiago Ramon y Cajal.
Cajal, yeah.
Artist, science, troublemaker. What's interesting to me in this book, and I mentioned this to you yesterday, is that it begins with just the character, the central character, who wants to be an artist, and his family is pretty set against it, to the point where they're hiring local artist to say he has no talent and stuff like that in order to break his spirit. But then in the last maybe fifth of the book, we discover that everything that he did as an artist pays off in science. Why did you? Is this part of your proselytizing for bringing art and science together in both the work that you do and in the teaching that you do?
Yeah. So I think that Cahal wrote a book called Advice for a Young Investigator, and I was given it by Sonny Boyd, who was on my committee when I was a graduate student at Notre Dame. And I really loved it, but I didn't really know his story. Very short book. And then during my postdoc, I had a friend, Harry Itagaki, who was doing his sabbatical in the lab that I was in at the time. He taught at Kenyon. And he introduced me to his memoir, which is this 600-page volume, which I started reading. And what's fascinating about this is that here's this guy that won the 1906 Nobel Prize. He essentially worked out, as definitively as anybody had at that time, that the brain was made of individual cells and not like a network of tubes like the circulatory system. So it was a huge deal because it actually laid the foundation for us to explain creativity, learning, all these other things, these dynamic processes. But I'm reading this memoir, and he covers a lot of his youth. I mean, it's like a quarter of the book, of a 600-page book about his youth. And what I was immediately struck by was that this guy just really wanted to be an artist more than anything in the world. That is all he wanted to be. And, his family said no. His dad was a local doctor who walked 200 miles to Barcelona to get his degree, and he'd be damned if his kid was going to be anything other than a doctor. And for me, again, from a personal standpoint, my family experience was completely different, right? My mom wanted me to minister, but then she's like, nah, maybe you should be an actor. And you know what? You should grow long hair, because I bet long hair would be cool. Now, my son has hair down to the middle of his back, so she finally got that payoff with Max. My hair just kind of grows out, and it's just ugly. Anyway, so I tried to imagine what it would be like to have a passion, to have this thing you desperately yearned to do, and have the one person, the two people, his parents, say, no, you can't. You're not allowed. To be told, no, it's sinful. Well, it was sinful. That was an incongruity to me. And so to be able to sort of, in effect, celebrate my parents by drawing such a sharp comparison to them, but the fact that he was just immensely creative. I mean, things that I can't even go into this. When he became a scientist, he wrote and drew like an early graphic novel-y type of thing in which he had an adventure in the body, right? And it was destroyed in a fire or something like that. I mean, it's really kind of heartbreaking. But here's a guy that always kept his art with him. His art and science for him were not, I mean, he built a cannon once out of a 2x4, right? That he hollowed out from his family's construction. And not only was it work of art, as he describes it, but it worked, right? He destroyed the neighbor's gate on their garden and got put in jail for 3 days. And his father said, don't feed him. He did not, and the thing is too that, we think now, oh, wouldn't it be nice to combine science and art? For him, he was like most kids, where you don't even conceptualize of separating them, right? I can remember Max and Jack when they were little. They would work together. Can we have a jar? Okay, you can have a jar. Okay, they'd go outside. They'd pick some grass and get the hose and put some water in there, put some salt in, pepper. Can we have some soap, Dad? Oh, of course you can have some soap. Because they had to make a formula. And right, so they're squirting their formula in there and they're shaking it up. And why are you doing this? Well, there's a dragon back behind the garage, and this is a potion that's going to fix it. Oh, okay, well, all right, well, what if you have to make it again? Oh, and then we said this, well, what if you have to make another batch? Oh, we've already drawn out everything. So for them, this idea of story, science, and art, it's all just one thing. And we work so effectively and and I say this as an instructor who's part of this system, with a wife who's also part of this system, in saying, no. If you like art, you go down to that room. And if you're good with science, you go up to that room. And if you want to tell stories, that's in another building altogether, right? We reinforce this notion that these things aren't. Now, listen, I'll be the first to say that when Klein Apis first came out, I benefited from places saying, look how weird this is, right? A scientist who draws stuff, that's weird. I'm like, yes, it is so weird.
Freaky.
I'll do another interview. Let me tell you, it's weird. You really should pay attention. But in reality, it's an unfortunate situation because it's at the center, each one of those activities is a creative endeavor, right? If you do science, a scientist does not walk into a lab and robotically go to a manual and say, this is the equation that I have to do in order to win a Nobel Prize, and today I will do it, right? In fact, if you're a scientist, you don't know the answer to something. You've got to come up with a way that either has never been done or is modified to essentially peer back, which is the same thing that an artist does. And so this notion that they're different has never really registered with me.
I love the example that you gave of Max and Jack working on the Canon, because one of my favorite things my son said as a child is one day he said, I'm a little bored, but we can get rid of that boredom a really easy way. And I said, oh yeah, how? And he's like, well, I won't tell you, but I need a hammer and a broken kaleidoscope. I was like, okay, yes. I can figure it out.
Yeah. Well,
I didn't have a kaleidoscope laying around. Maybe we should, for the last 10 minutes or so of the panel, transition into questions.
Great.
And I know somebody who has a question, so please. And then
Keep the question in the microphone.
I will.
So I've got two questions. This is both pretty quick. One, do you have any interest in making a book about Alexander von Humboldt?
Oh, okay. Any interest in making a book about Alexander?
Humboldt's really interesting, but I haven't read as much about him as I should. He was very much of a polymath at his time. And so, it's interesting because sometimes a subject is just so voluminous. Like this book, the Santiago book, I was interviewed by Chris Mountner once for the Comics Journal. That was 2003. And in that article, I had some initial artwork from Santiago, right? And that artwork is not used because I realized what I was doing then, I was just writing a biography. And Cahal already had a 600-page memoir. He'd already been biographied. I was contributing nothing new. It took me forever to come up with the approach, like the fact that I was going to focus on his youth, the fact that I was going to focus on. So folks like Humboldt are pretty interesting, but they're so voluminous that I'm not sure where I would focus. Like the same thing with the Darwin story. There's so much Darwin you can do. I mean, the trip on the Beagle alone, that 5 years, has just got so many cool stories. So I had to figure out how to narrow it down to say, okay, I'm just going to focus on his late life and this conversation. That's fanciful.
And a daily ritual of walking around the path.
So I would have to read more about Humboldt and then figure out, which element I could use.
If you have any interest in reading about Humboldt, there's an incredible book called The Invention of Nature.
Yes, I've seen that in the bookstore, and yeah. Okay.
We're talking about a book called The Invention of Nature, which is
right.
I'm not familiar with it, but thank you for the recommendation. You had one more question, you said?
And then I was also curious if you're familiar with Yuval Noah Harari.
I'm not.
Oh, that's he's the fellow asking if you're familiar with Harari, who is the guy who wrote the 'Sapiens books, and they've been turned into.
Yes. I'm sorry.
Right.
Yes, I am. I've started *Sapiens*.
I asked that because there's a great line that goes through most of his books of the incredible power of our collective storytelling ability.
Yeah.
There's a compliment here for Harari's storytelling ability. I'm just doing this for the people who are on. You're going to see this on YouTube. So
There's also a book called *The Storytelling Animal*, and I I have a Teflon brain when it comes to authors and things like that. It's there and then it slides off. But it's a book that a colleague of mine uses in his freshman writing course, and that I also use to some extent for my comics and culture gen ed course. But it's an interesting book about how we are sort of wired to tell stories, which is another reason why narrative, I think, is so important when you're approaching these things, is that you are tapping into the best type of wiring in our brain, pre-existing neural pathways, as a neurobiologist would say. Yeah.
Please.
I just think you're such a special person because you've got these perspectives from different angles, and the piece I want to hear a little bit about, if you can talk to, is just about the act of drawing.
Mm-hmm.
I'm really curious, like if that was your coping mechanism as a kid, and while you were doing all of these studies into science, did you take a lot of visual notes? And then now, as a teacher, do your students, do they draw in your classes? Is that part of how you let them learn? Because making comics, that's hard, and not everybody can do that, but everybody can draw. And I think you might have an interesting angle, or I'm really curious to your experience.
Yeah.
Well, let me repeat that.
Yep.
It's a question about what roles drawing has in your teaching practice, in your exploration,
And how I started.
and how
Yep.
you started. Sure, and Kara has, of course, a personal investment in this, talking about why it's so important for us to draw.
So I started drawing. The thing that I remember working on most was dinosaurs. Because now, I mean, shoot, you can go into
Yep,
the library
let
here,
me go.
shelves and shelves, right? But when I was a kid, it was, black and white books every once in a while, lots of text-heavy stuff.
This guy.
Oh, yeah, it's Stegron, the dinosaur man. And I had this Life or National Geographic magazine called The Dinosaurs. It's got a T-Rex and a Triceratops duking it out on the cover. And I loved dinosaurs, and I used that actually as the drawing board. And so you can actually, I still have it. You could do rubbings of the back and see the things so for me, drawing was a mechanism to bring the invisible to life, right? So in that case, it was dinosaurs. And I was going to be a paleontologist until I realized you had to be outside. And so
And you had to wear long pants
I
instead
know,
of
long
shorts.
pants in hot weather? No way. And so it was dinosaurs. But then, yes, as I, was a student, a lot of the material I would record was as drawings, as notes, right? So I would be a stenographer, but I was also quick enough that I could do doodles of images, slides that I might not have access to. But then as part of my studying, and this is something I work with my students on, as part of my studying, I would draw visual models of ideas, right? Not quite concept maps, because I was actually drawing the tangible biological things and trying to work out how they were connected. So when I transitioned to teaching, we're in an interesting era now where it used to be, like when I was a student, you were a stenographer. Now, that was unfortunate because that's probably not great teaching, right? If you're lecturing. So I try not to do that. But when I am sort of conveying information, I'll sometimes provide slides, but then I'll oftentimes just draw what's on the slide. But I'll draw it, but I'll build it, right? So if I've got the proximal tubule or the distal tubule of the kidney and the nephron, right? It may be projected up there. And if I just left it at that, well, the kids would listen, they'd write down, they'd write what I put on the board, but I start to draw it. And that's a trigger. They say, wow, he's drawn that on the board, I gotta draw it too. And suddenly they're drawing the nephron. And in doing so, they are constructing in their mind a two-dimensional model of what this thing is. And they've got this sort of tactile connection, because what I'll do is, okay, here's the glomerulus, and then I'll stop, and we'll talk about the glomerulus, and then, okay, here's the proximal tubule, and then we'll stop, we'll talk about the proximal tubule, and we'll move through this thing until we get to the urine, which is always exciting to talk about urine in class. And
Livens things
yes,
up.
whee! But that event, for me, as an instructor, does two things. The first is it makes them take notes. And there's so many ways where you can sit and type, or and we have data now that clearly shows that if you write things down, you remember it better, much better than typing. And as I point out to my students, much better than doing nothing. We've had our second test in our Gen Bio, and some kids are a little distressed. And I'm like, well, it's because, the minimal information that I put on the slide is really just a cue intellectually. So you have access to the slides and you know the big ideas, but those larger concepts, the depth, the detail, that's what's missing. And so when I draw, and I try to draw everything, it doesn't matter whether I've got 2 birds and I'm doing natural selection, I wind up drawing it so they use it. And hopefully I get them to the point at the end of the semester where they're doing it more, because I think that model building is huge.
Yeah, I saw you do that yesterday with the kids when they were building a bee.
We did build a bee. It was a lot of fun.
Yes. Maybe just one more question since it's 1:52. So Ken?
So you talked a little bit about this before with the idea of, as a scientist, maybe a good artist.
Yeah.
Good scientist, but it feels like you live in kind of 2 separate worlds, and I understand that as an artist who does a lot of music and records, theme stuff,
Right.
And the comics, and it's a different world. So I was wondering how you navigate going back and forth of bringing the same material to, like, say, a group of scientific peers as opposed to a group of comic peers.
So how you move out of the different worlds of art and science?
So, I think the thing is, this is the other thing that I've always found interesting is that my experience is that artists really like to learn about science. And scientists love to hear about art, typically, at least the ones that I'm around. So I'm at a small liberal arts school, right? But I think this is true of people in general, right? People in general are curious as long as you make the information accessible, right? If you approach them with a desire, I always tell my students as they're learning to do presentations, because we get really good at training our students to get to this point where they can sound like a scientist, where they're throwing around the jargon and I'll go to a senior thesis and not understand what the hell they're talking about, which is actually why I started teaching a class called Talk Nerdy to Me, so that I can get these kids into a class and say, okay, look, Da Vinci said, I can't remember the exact quote, but essentially simplicity is the most sophisticated elegance or something like that. Yeah. And I just made it very unelegant. But the point is that the really smart people, is what I say, can tell you something complicated in simple terms. And so if that's what you're thinking, if that's always your mode, then the transitions between the two are not that difficult, right? Because if you keep in mind that, and the fact that if you're moving from comics to music, you got that core creativity. So writing a song and writing a comic, there's probably a fair degree of symmetry, enough that we could talk about it, right? Designing an experiment, writing a short story, I know for a fact there's enough there that we can talk about it. And my experience, at least from the scientist side, is that scientists get so excited, especially ones that are working in more of a teaching environment, so excited about different modes of expression and communication. So finding these different ways to connect, because at some level, we're trained as scientists to be very objective, but there's nothing objective about science. If you're a scientist, you've met scientists, I don't doubt, who will make your eyes glaze over because they're so passionate about this mite that they're working on, right? That's not objectivity. That's passion. And the idea is how do we capture that passion in a way that doesn't make your eyes glaze over? And so I think that transition has been relatively easy as long as I keep that in mind, that I can't hit you or overburden you with jargon. But I do respect the idea that as a intrinsically creative ape, that if I do it in the right way, that we can connect.
All right, maybe we should end there since it's 1:56.
Okay.
I don't know if there's another panel here in this room, but I know you need to get back to your table. But I'm sure Jay would be happy to stick around for a bit and answer personal questions.
Absolutely.
Well, not personal questions. We already found out how you feel about God.
We've done the wart and God, so I mean that's.
And just join me in thanking him for joining us here at CXC.
Thank you. Those were great questions.